You sound very healthy.
I had that disgusting H2N3, whatever it's called, this new
Yeah.
flu that's going
Okay.
around that they have nothing to offer you for. And it put me out for 10 days. And in those 10 days, Maduro was kidnapped. Protests started in Iran. And I was just sitting there going, "Ah," you
The
know,
timing was perfect, is what you're
it was
saying.
perfect timing. And now I've come out of it. And here we
And you're in the
are.
middle of it.
Um, Holy shit, Anthony, Happy New Year,
Happy New
2026.
Year. It's gonna be a interesting year. Yeah.
I haven't
Uh,
talked to you since I think the last time we spoke, your documentary series
about a
on
year ago,
book
Palestine
Palestine
Laboratory.
Laboratory had come
Yeah.
out. And I just finished watching your doc on Germany. Really beautiful piece,
Thank you.
looking at Germany and Israel, and a very personal piece
Mm.
also about your own familial history
Yeah, thank you.
in Germany and the Holocaust. And I want to get to
Yeah.
all of that, but I just want to start with the news of the day on Iran.
Mm.
What I know we've talked about Iran before, you and I. I know that you're familiar with the
I am.
country, the
And I have
history.
friends there at the moment, actually. I mean, not friends. I mean, they're Iranian who are in Iran, but yes.
What do you make of what's going on?
Um,
It's a big question, I know, but
it's a big
just your
question. Look, I
overall.
think there's a few things to say, and this is not in particular order. The regime that runs Iran has no legitimacy. I mean, that was the case arguably from 1979, but certainly does not have any legitimacy now. I say that based on repressive, authoritarian, killing its own citizens. And this was the case, as you would know very well, Samira, for years.
Mhm.
Does this mean that there's not foreign meddling? There clearly is foreign meddling to an extent. I mean, there was a great story in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper last year, of Israel, which I know some viewers will be aware of backing a social media campaign to support the return of the Shah, who obviously lives in California, has lived there for, I think, 40 odd years.
Maryland.
Sorry,
Yeah,
Maryland.
he's in
My
Maryland,
apologies.
yeah. Most of his
Maryland.
supporters are
Sorry,
in California.
California. And I'm aware that there is some support in Iran for him, but from my understanding is relatively small. I think my sense is, speaking to people, I haven't spoken to Iranian friends in the last days, but in general, in the last, I guess, 12 months, look, US sanctions have been punishing. The Israel-Iran war last year was devastating, killed huge amounts of people. Repression from the Iranians increased. The ultimate question is the Iranians have to choose their own future. And although there are clearly some, even young Iranians who would support the regime, who do support the regime, it seems it's obviously very hard to get accurate polling, but I think it's fair to say that a sizable proportion of Iranians, particularly younger ones, simply don't see that regime as legitimate. The question is what comes next. And it's interesting, on the Israeli press, there was an
Mm.
interview a few days ago on one of the more right-wing networks, although most Israeli media is right-wing these days, essentially saying that the so-called Israeli vision is what happened to Syria at the end of Assad, right? Which is a fragmented, balkanized country that poses no military threat to anybody and is fractured beyond belief. And
I
I
think
would
that was
argue,
the military correspondent for Channel
yes.
14 who said,
Now, he's obviously not the government, but I think that would reflect Israeli government thinking. I would argue that the Iranians were never a serious threat to Israel anyway, which I guess is a different conversation. Militarily, you could argue theologically, I think a lot of Israelis did feel threatened by the rhetoric that the Iranians have been spewing for years. Israel has no right to exist, wipe it from the map. The funding of various proxy groups around the region. I'm not denying any of that. It's a reality. Although most of those groups have now been defanged at best. I mean, Hamas is a shadow of its former self. Hezbollah certainly is. The Syrians no longer. Assad is gone. Iran is a very weak economic country, and I think people deserve a hell of a lot better. So what does that mean? I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess ultimately it means that the Iranians themselves need to choose, and I fear that many outside forces will not allow that to happen. That's what I
yeah,
worry about.
yeah. And that's what a lot of Iranians have told me that they're worried about, is that they won't be the ones who really
Yes.
choose what happens to their country and to them. What do you make of this? I want to ask you because you're on social media. I mean,
Mm,
a little bit, but what do
quite
you
a
make
lot.
of this? Have you seen this? What do you call it? Messaging. I call it propaganda, but this messaging around, where are all the
Yes.
pro-Palestinian protesters now? Why aren't they supporting the Iranians? Why do you think this campaign is being launched? What role is it supposed to play?
Well, firstly, it's a mother of all distractions. It's to
Mm,
suggest somehow that why are all these leftists apparently obsessed with Israel but don't care about dead Iranians or dead Sudanese or whatever. And my response is a very clear one, which is we should obviously care about what's happening in Iran, but there's a fundamental difference here. The US and Australia and Europe and the UK back, fund, and arm Israel. We're not backing and funding and arming Iran. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't care about the Iranian people. I certainly do care about them. I was there in 2007. I have friends. Most of them have now left Iran, I have to say. There are some who still live there. There's a fundamental difference. We have a responsibility, I think, and a greater chance of impact to talk about countries or people with whom we have a culpability. And this is not to suggest that Western sanctions have not played, which they have, mostly from Washington, a completely disastrous impact on Iran. And it's worth saying that many so-called backers of US sanctions have said, from Mike Pompeo and others, the aim is to make Iranian civilians suffer. It's not about the regime, it's about civilians suffering. Sanctions always have that impact, as it did in Iraq during Saddam. Saddam himself wasn't really impacted at all. So my response to that is, I mean, it's classic kind of whataboutism, really, isn't it? It's essentially saying that we shouldn't be focusing, why are you obsessed with Israel? And my response is people are supposedly obsessed with Israel because they've been seeing on their phones for, well, certainly since October 7, a barrage of Israeli crimes and violence and ugliness, which doesn't at all mean that a humanitarian doesn't care about what's happening in Sudan or Myanmar or Iran. They should. And talk about it and engage and want people in those countries to have better futures. But, for example, Australia, where I am based, is not backing the Myanmar junta. They're just not. Whereas we are backing and arming the Israelis. So do I have more chance as one individual or even with a voice to impact my own government's policies or public conversation about Israel than I have about, for example, Myanmar, which is a repressive regime killing its own citizens? Of course I have more chance of impacting that. So I dismiss it as the mother of all distractions, which, by the way, I've seen and heard for years and
yeah, yeah.
years and years. And I don't really think it has much impact on people who care about these issues. I mean, maybe some people feel guilted into speaking out, and people should care about Iran, of course.
It's interesting though that because it's not just the usual like Israeli influencers like Hen Mazik or Hananya
Mm.
Naftali. I mean, you have people like Ian Bremmer, sorry, engaging in this sort of rhetoric
Ian
too.
Bremmer. Isn't he a propagandist? I mean, Ian Bremmer. Ian Bremmer, yeah, I don't know Ian personally, so hi, Ian, if you're watching. But, Ian Bremmer is not exactly what I would call a deeply insightful thinker about the world. Ian Bremmer wants to go to Davos and sort of, go to have fun with his elite mates. I mean, sure, people like that make those comments, and I don't really think Ian Bremmer is going to be changing the course of history, do you?
Um, let's leave Iran a little bit because I want to stay. You brought up Australia.
Mm.
We went through Pompeo, but do you have Iranian friends in Australia? Like
I do have some, yeah.
what is the diaspora there doing? Because I'm obsessed with diaspora politics. Do you sort of see the diaspora there? What are they about? I don't know
It's
much
not.
about.
Yeah, I can't tell you the numbers of people off the top of my head. I'm not quite sure. They're not, I would say in general, I don't want to generalize American Iranians because that would be unfair, but I know there is a very rabid element within the Iranian diaspora in the US, which essentially would be very happy for the US to bomb Iran tomorrow or others. I think there is a degree of skepticism and fear of foreign intervention. There's no doubt some people, as they were in 2003 with Iraqis who hated Saddam, who were worried about an US invasion, but were initially welcoming of US military actions that, of course, turned into a disaster very quickly. So, yeah, my sense is in Australia, those voices are either not as loud as the US. And so, in some ways, in fact, the person who I think is probably the most, this person's not even Iranian, who's most prominent here on this issue is Kylie Moore-Gilbert, who's Australian.
Oh my God, yeah.
Who, as viewers may remember, was in prison for 2 years in Evian prison in Tehran, is now out and living, I think, in Melbourne. I don't know Kylie. I don't know her personally. But she's very high. She's not calling for, massive military airstrikes, I don't think, but is certainly would support the overthrow of the regime. I don't want to speak for her, but she's a very prominent voice here on this issue.
And how has, because I also haven't spoken to you since is it Bondi?
Bondi, yeah, Bondi Beach. Yeah.
I haven't spoken to you since the Bondi Beach attack, but I have been watching how that attack has been sort of been utilized. Is that
weaponized?
Weaponized in Australian politics. But could you talk to me a little bit about that? What you're seeing in terms of how it's been used to stifle free speech, or how it's being used in Australian politics?
So in mid-December, just for people who don't know, there was a terrorist attack at Bondi, which is sort of a very popular beach here. And a lot of tourists go there and locals, and 15 people were murdered by two men, father and son, who were Indian background, seemingly ISIS-inspired, ISIS-backed. We still don't know all those details. And within literally hours of it happening, there were calls by the pro-Israel lobby and allegations that this had all to do with the fact that there's been 2+ years of protests for Palestine in Australia. We need to therefore stop these protests. They are creating an atmosphere of hate towards Jews. The fact that our government, like your government in Canada, recognised Palestine last year, all these things were said to contribute to an atmosphere of hatred towards Jews, which therefore apparently, so the argument goes, led to these two lunatics murdering not only Jews, but principally Jews. And I utterly, fundamentally reject that insanity. There is literally at this point zero connection between these two killers and the pro-Palestine movement. And since this attack, there has been a massive increase in rhetoric by not just the Murdoch press here, which is very influential, but a lot of the media outlets, government figures and others, saying that we really need to investigate the surge in anti-Semitism. This is the argument, the surge in anti-Semitism, which led to this kind of attack. Now, I, as a Jew, have no issue with investigating anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is an ancient disease and hatred and clearly exists and is worsening in some parts of the world. But to make the completely dishonest connection between that and the pro-Palestine movement protests is a connection which we simply have to refuse. And now we have a situation where Australia has called something called a Royal Commission, which is basically the highest level of investigation a government can call. Okay, haven't too.
Yeah.
Now, they've had a long history. Sometimes they've been useful, sometimes they haven't. Okay, it's been called by the government after lots of pressure. It should report by the end of the year. And some of it's to investigate the attack, which of course is required and necessary. But a lot of it, I fear, is going to be weaponizing anti-Semitism in the service of silencing critical voices on Israel and Palestine. Now, Australia is, on one level, a relatively small country like Canada, but not exactly dictating global foreign policy here. But Australia is seen as a close ally of Israel. There's no question about that. Australia has sent weapons parts to Israel, has continued to sell weapons parts to Israel in the last years during the genocide. None of that has stopped.
Is Australia part of the Five Eyes?
Yes.
Yeah, it is. Okay.
Indeed, yes. So we are part of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing. We have in the center of Australia one of the biggest US intelligence bases in the world called Pine Gap, which is been around for about 50 odd years and is deeply useful for the US in its war fighting around the world. It's been used to gather intelligence during the Iraq and Afghan conflicts. And we have evidence to suggest that it was providing evidence from the US to Israel since October 7. So Australia is deeply complicit in what is going on. Now, the idea that having conversations about any of that somehow makes it unsafe for Jews in Australia, I utterly reject. Now, are there some Jews who feel uncomfortable when you would say, free Palestine? Yes, there probably are. To which I would say, okay, we live in a free country, apparently, so I'm told. We're allowed to say free Palestine. I'm allowed to say Israel's committing genocide. You can disagree and say that I'm speaking nonsense. Fine. But what I fear is the desire by many of the key actors in this debate, which I fear a Royal Commission will legitimize, is not really about Bondi. It's about finding a legal and political mechanism by which potentially there can be a silencing or curtailing of critical voices. And of course, we're seeing this in your country, US, UK. On some level, why would Australia be immune? We're on the other side of the world, but we're a supposedly Western country-ish, a British colony, now an American colony. We have a complicated relationship with history. And I worry that that is where this debate is going. I don't think it's going to work. And just finally on this point, it's worth saying that all this is going to lead to more anti-Semitism. I mean, to me, it's just a no-brainer that when the average person sees powerful Jewish groups, Murdoch Press, which essentially is just a propaganda arm of the Israeli government, calling for curtailing of legitimate speech on Israel, Netanyahu. I mean, within hours of the Bondi attack, Netanyahu and many senior ministers were putting on social media, well, this is what happens when you allow pro-Palestine protests. In the week after the attack, he sent out some of his key far-right ministers to Australia to show solidarity with Australia, which essentially was a way for them to come here and attack Australia. Now, I'm not defending Anthony Albanese, my Prime Minister. If he has failed or there's been intelligence failures, which it seems like there was, my guess is he'd never heard of these two killers before the day of the attack. The intelligence services may well have, they said, I think we know they did. And if heads need to roll, then heads need to roll. I've got no problem with that. And if Albanese is in some ways complicit or turned a blind eye, I have no issue holding him to account. But that's not what this is about, right? And it's the weaponization of Jewish trauma, Samira, in the service of the most extreme Israeli policies. And finally, the idea that the Murdoch Press or the Australian government or anyone would look to the Netanyahu government for moral direction. Are you kidding me? This is what's been happening for a month now. And happening in the elite level. I like to think that many people in the public can see through that bullshit. I like to think they do. Obviously, it's a summer here, so it's a bit of a quieter time of year in general. It's like, I guess, your August or something where people are often on holiday.
Yeah. But
I think people have been pretty switched on because of the Bondi attack and the atmosphere that exists here, particularly because I'm in Sydney.
Here, our press really jumped on the whole, this is what globalized the Intifada looks like. That was the rhetoric that was used. And you
same here.
Even from David Frum at The Atlantic, who pretends to be Canadian.
Does he pretend to be? Because he's ashamed of being an American. I know he's Canadian. Yes. The fact that he's listened to, but the fact that someone like him is listened to on anything when he was, as I'm sure people may be aware, was deeply involved. In fact, wrote, am I right in saying, the speeches for George W. Bush and Axis of Evil? So he's a moral direction. Thanks, David. Yeah, right.
But that was the rhetoric that you saw here, even because Canada recognized Palestine.
Yes. We're quite similar as countries, aren't we, in many ways, Australia and Canada.
Yes, we're all Commonwealth. And so I want to jump now to, because this is part of this whole thing, the Adelaide Writers Festival.
Yes.
This is the largest literary festival in Australia, and it basically just imploded.
Yes.
I've been watching this happen. What is the word? Disinvited, uninvited. Palestinian Australian lawyer, writer Randa Abdel Fattah, because just let me get the wording here, because they said it was culturally insensitive to have her at the festival. And then 180 writers basically said they
Withdrew
want nothing
in
to do with this
solidarity.
festival,
Yes.
in solidarity with Rwanda, and then the board, was it today? They just canceled the festival.
It's collapsed. I mean, the short, you got the summary pretty much correct. It's worth saying that one part that they mentioned, the letter when Rwanda was uninvited, this was only a week ago, was that since Bondi, the Bondi attack, it would be, as you said, culturally insensitive. They said, just to be clear, we're not saying you have anything to do with the Bondi attack, Rwanda. However, it's culturally insensitive to have you there, so you're not coming. Now, apart from the insane racism of that kind of comment and baffling response, which, by the way, the Premier of South Australia, which is the state where Adelaide is, has doubled and tripled down on those kinds of comments to the point where Rwanda is now suing him for defamation, a slightly separate issue but not unrelated. And I think in many ways, look, Adelaide, I wasn't invited this year, but I've been before. It's a massive festival because it's free. It's supported by the state. And it's outside. As I said, it's summer here. It happens in about a month or so. And people just sort of sit under these huge gardens. And I think last year there were 170,000 people who went. It's massive, right? And there's speakers from all over the world, Australian, all over the world. And the vast majority pulled out in solidarity with Rwanda, but also the idea somehow that it was deemed inappropriate to have one of the only Palestinian voices. And it's worth saying there were other speakers invited who would have said exactly the same thing. Jewish, Palestinian.
I think it's also worth saying that Louise Adler, who is Jewish,
yes,
and I think was head of the festival.
She was.
She resigned.
Well, she had to resign. I mean, I've known Louise for 20 years. She published, in fact, my first book, My Israel Question, in 2006. And at the time, it became this massive bestseller. But there were attempts by the pro-Israel lobby then and government of the day and ministers to literally pulp the book, which failed. I mean, insane. So, yes, Louise was director of the festival. She essentially was overruled, I guess, by the board above her. And in the end, it was announced yesterday, she didn't really have much of a choice but to resign. But again, it goes to the same point. Now, you and I would see that and say, what a disaster. A cultural event has been destroyed. But there's a side of me that actually wonders if there's more going on there. That I'm not suggesting that the powers that be, their aim was to destroy the festival this year. I mean, I don't know. But in a way, what it has done, I think, is to yet again restrict the chances of having open and free conversation at a major event on Israel, Palestine, Zionism, imperialism, etc. And there's been so many examples of this happening in Australia, Canada, US, UK, Europe since October 7, that I am not that convinced that the right lessons are being learned. In fact, the lesson often is you can blow things up. I don't mean the literal sense, but you can cancel events, cancel speakers, cancel talks. And those talks just don't happen. So it's not going to be an alternative Adelaide Writers Festival this year. Maybe they'll be coming back next year. I hope they will. But this is the increasing restriction on what so-called speech is acceptable, which does tie in some ways to what we talked about a minute ago about Bondi, that the attempt by pro-Israel forces, those Jewish and otherwise, to say Australia cannot handle and tolerate critical voices about Israel-Palestine, whether you're Jewish, Arab, Muslim, whatever, because it hurts Jewish feelings and leads to Bondi. Now, the connection was made by the festival that Rwanda's presence would somehow endanger Jews? I mean, it's worth saying that we now know that a number of Israel lobbyists in Adelaide pressured the festival to kick her out. They clearly capitulated very quickly. Whether they expected an avalanche of other cancellations, I don't know. If they didn't, they're naive as hell. I don't know. But no, it's really on the one hand, you can say it's a really positive sign of solidarity. All these people realize, as I said, internationally famous writers, Australian writers, that this is not acceptable. But moving forward, I think the verdict is very much out, whether, in fact, the institutions are growing a backbone, I actually don't see much evidence of that. I'm not even talking about Adelaide now. I'm saying in
that
general.
was my next question is what about these institutions? I mean, we had the same thing with the Giller Prize here in Toronto that was funded by Scotiabank, which is
Yes.
connected to Elbit Systems,
Yes.
one of the big funders. And we had this Giller Prize really have to sort of rethink its funding model and all of this, and all of the writers pulled out. But I don't see, after 2.5 years now of this genocide, institutions really trying to do anything to, in a way, regain the trust of the public.
I feel the same way. In Australia now, there's been so many examples of institutions, large and small, cancelling people, silencing people. I'm not just talking about media organisations, huge amounts of organisations, from the music industry to classical music to literary festivals. And I think in some ways, many institutions increasingly are so corporatized with no real political or cultural understanding of the issues. My sense is many of them, and this is not an excuse, but they get a letter from a pro-Israel lobbyist who says, if you program this person, you are literally contributing to anti-Semitism. And they kind of go, holy shit, really? God, okay, oh my God. Now, again, there are certain conversations that will make people uncomfortable. This to me is actually what literary festivals, public events should be doing. I'm not saying every conversation has to make you uncomfortable, but my response is, if you don't want to go, don't go. No one's forcing you to go. I mean, it's a public event, it's free. If you don't want to go, don't go. Now, I think there is something about, and as a Jew, there's something I'm seeing more and more happening. I mean, the kind of Jewish groups that are frankly very aligned with the Netanyahu government, often aligned with the Ben Gvir faction of the Israeli government. The idea that they are saying to the public, we are upset about somebody saying Israel's committing genocide, and that claim is accepted blindly without someone saying, hang on a minute. You can't on the one hand say you support free speech, and then you're telling me you're upset that Runda or me is saying Israel's committing war crimes in Palestine, and yet your practical policy positions are blind support from Netanyahu government, even if you don't accept it's genocide, who've committed mass war crimes, which, by the way, many IDF soldiers are saying themselves and posting it online. It's not like we're making this shit up, right?
Yeah, right.
And the problem is that those allegations are just accepted wholesale. And I do still see that, in a way, 80 years as a shadow of the Holocaust. There's no other way to see that. It's serious. I'm not saying these people, none of us were alive, obviously, in 1940 or 45, but we're still living in the shadow of the Holocaust. I honestly think that we are. And that's not an excuse for censoring, of course, but I really do feel that way in many ways. And I worry that that shadow is now weaponized to support the most extreme policies in Israel-Palestine, which are endangering all Jews. I mean, it's so blatantly obvious, isn't it, right? That Israeli government policy, which is hated in many parts of the world, based on polling, young people, especially US, Australia, Europe, I think Canada, UK, not all, but many, have seen what they've seen for 2 years. We've seen it. Now, what's the chances of you having a warm, fuzzy feeling about Israel right now? Hello? Is that going to lead some people to be anti-Semitic? Yes, it will, which is not acceptable. But we can't be that surprised when pro-Israel forces say there's no difference between a Jew and a Zionist. They're the same thing. So what if they don't make a difference, then why do we expect the general public to either? This is the danger.
There was actually an op-ed today in the National Post, which is like our most right-wing national paper here, and the op-ed was arguing that every Jewish person is an IDF soldier. And I was just like, oh my God, like, how could you make this connection? In
This
this
is written
day
by a
and
Jewish person, I guess, or
it
not that it
was,
particularly matters, I guess, but
it was.
Well, look, I mean, obviously I haven't read the piece, but it doesn't overly surprise me. I mean, this is kind of something that I'm seeing, and again, this was happening before October 7, is that as Israel and its people and its government moves further and further to the far right, the pro-Israel ideologues in the West have to go with them. You have nowhere else to go. You either choose to disassociate, say, I don't support occupation forever or genocide in Gaza, or you go off the cliff with Israel.
Mm.
And there are growing numbers of Jews. I see this in the community here, the vast majority of so-called mainstream Jewish organizations in your country, my country, US, England, and elsewhere. They will go with Israel off the cliff. They'll go with them off the cliff. And we can't be therefore surprised that many young Jews, 18 to 35, and again, based on polling, are saying, absolutely not. Not in my name. And that to me is encouraging. But that sort of argument that every Jew, and there's about 16, 17 million of us in the world, have a target on our back because what we're all unofficial card-carrying members of the IDF, how do you think non-Jews view that? They say, right, so does that mean that 16 million people around the world, Jews, support what Israel's been doing, what I've been watching on my phone? Is that what you're telling me? And therefore, I hate those people. I mean,
Yeah,
it's just so
that's the
dangerous.
danger. Yeah.
It's so
Yeah.
dangerous, you know?
And, that's a great segue. I think you brought up a lot of points which reminded me. I was talking earlier about the documentary you had made in Germany.
Mm.
And I was going to ask you, because I've always wondered how the Holocaust is even taught in Germany. Like, what are the lessons that people are supposed to take away from that? What did you learn anything about that while you were doing this?
So I made a film just so people can watch it. It's called Germany's Israel Obsession, which came out in the second half of last year on Al Jazeera. You can find it on YouTube. I'm a German citizen. I'm also Australian. Essentially, it was a film investigating why Germany, maybe more than many other Western states, apart from the US, is so fanatically pro-Israel. Repressing Palestinian thought, repressing Palestinians. Some people may have seen online just insane police violence against peaceful protests in Berlin and Hamburg and elsewhere. And essentially, I think it's a twisted, deluded way of appeasing their own guilt for the Holocaust in the service of what they see as a Jewish state that has to be supported no matter what. I mean, when Angela Merkel was chancellor, she said that essentially Israel is Germany's reason of state. So that really means that Israel can do pretty much.
Say that again.
When Angela Merkel was chancellor,
Israel is Germany's.
Essentially, a key reason of state of Germany is supporting Israel as a way to
Like repent or
basically
penance or
endless repentance. Now, again, I have no issue with Germany and Germans dealing with their own guilt, which frankly is justified considering what happened to my people and many others, gay people and others. But not that I blame a 4-year-old German, obviously, but, Germany has this in their history and we can't ignore that reality. You ask how Germans often deal with the Holocaust. Well, it's changed over the years. For many, many years, Germany didn't talk about the Holocaust in a way. It was denied. Then it moved to the idea that we had no culpability at all. We were victims. The Germans were victims, which is still, by the way, how the Poles very much see their role. Now, I'm not saying every Pole, but the Polish government is often in battles, has been over the years with Israel, ironically, saying, I mean, Israel, of course, has made peace with the far right, so now they love Poland again. But in general, there has been tension at times. People, Israel and Jews saying, hang on a minute, Poland, you cannot say you were not culpable, but a lot of your people were involved in the Holocaust. You were not German, but you were culpable. Hello, I mean, I've been to Auschwitz. Auschwitz is on the edge of a major town. What do you think was going on there for years and years? So in Germany, the role of how they view their own history has changed. The history is not entirely badly taught. There is an understanding of how it happened, what led up to the rise of Hitler, how so many Germans were, I don't know if the word is brainwashed or believed a lie that he was going to bring a 1,000-year Reich and that Jews were the main impediment to that. And I think there is a growing acceptance that Germany has, I mean, of course there were German victims too, but the vast majority of Germans either stayed silent or were complicit. the irony is that what has happened in Germany, I think blind support for Israel is leading to this. The far right is in the ascendancy. The AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland Party, is getting about 25 to 30% in the polls. They are far right. They are deeply intolerant and hate.
Oh, is this the party that Elon Musk
Yes,
spoke at their
absolutely.
conference and said,
Yes,
"Be proud of who you are, be
totally.
proud of your history"? Oh, that's them.
Yes.
Okay.
So the AfD is not in government. There was an election last year and they're not in government, but they're doing incredibly well. And in some ways, as we say in the film, the AfD and other far-right parties use Israel and blind support for it as a washing machine to launder their image as good people. So if you're a far-right leader and you say, well, I love Israel, how can you accuse me of anti-Semitism? What are you
Tommy
talking about?
Robinson.
Indeed. Well, Tommy Robinson's a classic case of that. A far-right thug from the UK who essentially went last year to Israel on an all-expenses-paid trip by Israel to come back and show the glories of the Zionist state to his far-right thugs in the UK and elsewhere. These, and I think in some ways, I mean, the film doesn't solely focus on this, but it talks about it at the end. There is a growing global alliance between Israel and the far right. I mean, just the end of this month, the Israeli government is hosting, for the second time, a conference of the European far right. I mean, so inviting far-right leaders from across Europe, many of whose parties have neo-Nazi backgrounds, don't like Jews, but are happy to launder their image in support of Israel and its genocide.
Is the hatred of Muslims the great unifier here?
Yes.
That's
Hatred of Muslims and hatred of immigration.
There was a point in your in the documentary where you were speaking to writer Deborah Feldman.
Yeah, he's great.
And she
yeah.
tells this story of being at a conference where someone stands up and says to her, Nazis are not the problem anymore. It's
Muslims are, absolutely.
And that really resonated with me because I started sort of understanding that this is the great unifier now.
Totally.
Right?
And across much of the far-right universe, and indeed Israel, which is why so many of the far-right view Israel as a model, which in some ways goes back on one level to the Palestine laboratory, but also the wider context that Israel is seen as an ideological model, an ethno-nationalist wet dream. The far right in Germany or Sweden or elsewhere doesn't want to have a Jewish state in Sweden or Germany. They want to have a Christian fundamentalist ethno-nationalist state that kicks out those who are not like that. That is what the glue that binds them together. But the fact that a Jewish state partners with these people, romances these people, and this is what ties into Germany with the film, is that the far right are gaining in popularity for a range of reasons. Economic issues, the East and the West, although obviously they unified decades ago, the East generally did not really do that well economically. Here we are 30 years on after the reunification of East and West Germany, and they're struggling, and they're blaming immigrants and etc. And you know what worries me being in Germany, and I didn't feel unsafe there being a Jew, not at all, is that there actually aren't that many Jews in Germany. Some Jews did move back to Germany. Some Jews obviously survived the Holocaust. There aren't that many Jews in Germany. There are a number of, ironically, Israelis who moved to Berlin in the last 30 years as an escape for the far-right fuckery in Israel, who are relatively progressive people. I mean, not all of them, but some of them. And they are now seeing almost like the limits of that. The limits is that Germany is sat here.
They're the ones being silenced now. Like,
Indeed.
You're not the good Jew.
Exactly. The good Jew is someone who essentially shows blind dedication to the Israeli government, whatever it is. And so I see Germany now as a deeply confused, angry, scary place because they are moving towards a potential future which, for example, the AfD advocates this concept you may have heard called remigration, which is getting a lot of traction in the far-right circles. Remigration is basically a party that comes into power that forcibly removes people who have come legally to their country, which I guess in some ways what Trump is doing in the US.
Right, yeah.
They are there legally from usually brown and black countries. And remigration has a lot of traction in many of these European nations as a supposed solution to their economic troubles. I mean, they're going to find out that's complete bullshit, but that's essentially what the argument is. And in Germany, I think you see, and we try to uncover this, that the Jewish identity that the German elites are pushing is an identity which is uncritical towards Netanyahu and his behavior in Gaza, but more broadly talks about how it's almost like, a lot of these, the country is full of anti-Semitism commissioners, many of whom are non-Jewish. So you have this ridiculous situation where you have non-Jews telling me what is acceptable speech and what is anti-Semitic and what is not. And what's anti-Semitic, of course, is not dissimilar to what we hear from pro-Israel lobbies here in Australia or Canada, which is, sure, criticize Israel if you want, but there's a line. What's that line? Well, we can't say what that line is, but there's a line. And the line is, you can maybe say you have disagreements with Netanyahu, but beyond that, no, you're anti-Semite. I mean, Germany's in a dark place, Samira, honestly. And the reason we made the film was partly because we felt, the filmmaker and I, Dan, from London, is that a lot of people I don't think know what's happening in Germany. It's a massive European state that doesn't get nearly enough attention, I think, in the Western press. And what's happening there, I think, heralds what's happening to a lot of Europe at the moment. And it's worrying. And Israel is one part of that, not the only part, but it's a key part.
Why do you think Israel is courting these far-right groups? I mean, you were saying that they're holding this conference again. Why are they doing that?
They want friends. I mean, you laugh, but that's part of it. They want people who love them. I mean, a few years ago, there was a comment made by a senior Israeli minister, I'm paraphrasing here, something like, we've lost Jewish liberals in America. It's over. They don't like us. This is before October 7th. And the key demographic for Israel has been evangelicals in the US, who are increasingly, by the way, splintering over Israel, blind supporters it used to be, and I guess increasing the far right. And I see it as partly a marriage of convenience, but actually it's a marriage of ideology. They actually think remarkably similarly. The idea that many of the Israeli far right also don't like other Jews, like me, they barely even see me as Jewish because I dare criticize them.
You're a couple.
Exactly.
Blah, blah, blah.
Indeed. Which is obviously absurd, but that's how they view it. And the far right welcomes them. It embraces them. It gives them influence across Europe, whether these far right parties are in power or not.
They want support.
They want support.
Yeah.
And they see in some ways where the political tide is moving. Don't want to generalize, but in many countries, the far right is in the ascendancy. It doesn't always even have to win government because you influence political ideas and political policy, even from opposition, right? You don't always have to be the prime minister or the president. So I see it pretty cynically, but I think in many ways it is an ideological alignment that makes so much sense between Israel and the global far right. I mean, the most prominent example I talk about in the book is India, which obviously is not in Europe, but I mean, it's Modi, who's a far-right fundamentalist, obviously is Hindu.
Who wants the ethno state too. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, he's building one in India. So, yeah, Israel is making friends with some very ugly people. And unsurprisingly, a lot of Jews aren't that big a fan of that.
It's interesting you bring up India too, because here, the Zionist organizations like the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, or some of these other groups that have popped up post-October 7th, there is this real support of Hindus, Hindu nationalism. So when you see the protests happening here, you will see the Indian flag at Israeli events. And I'm always like, what is that?
And of course, what connects those movements is a contempt and hatred of Muslims. Because, of course, what Modi is doing in India is building a Hindu fundamentalist state that discriminates and wants to kick out the roughly 200 million Muslims, which is, of course, what Israel is trying to do in Palestine. Not all Palestinians are Muslim, but the majority are. And what much of the global far right wants to do to their own countries. They see Islam as an infection. They want to get rid of. And that is, sadly, as we know, getting increasing amounts of traction. And it worries me deeply, as it should worry any sane person. So yes, I mean, it's like going to a far-right rally in London, people who traditionally have hated Jews and seeing the Israeli flag. I mean, Tommy Robinson's a big fan of Israel, said he went there, but he's one of many. And the idea that so-called pro-Israel forces do not see that kind of marriage as utterly disastrous for their future is mind-boggling. But they don't. They embrace it, or they turn a blind eye.
I worry about that in my own community. I mean, you go to protests, against the Iranian government, and you're seeing Israeli flags there.
Indeed.
And that really worries me.
Oh.
Because I don't know what it is a sign of. My biggest fear right now is that this anti-Arab, really pervasive nationalism and fascistic politics is what I see in the Iranian movement right now. And it's really, really bad.
You're talking about mostly within Iran or in the diaspora?
Both.
Both, yeah.
Both. Because of the nature of the regime, there is a real, people were setting mosques on fire.
Yeah, I saw
right?
that.
There is this real sort of anti-Muslim bent to what is happening, that then, it's something that it's not just geared towards, the clerics are bad, or I don't like this policy.
It's the religion.
It's religion outright. It's Muslims, it's Islam, period. And it's very worrying. Anyways, on that worrying note, I just want to thank you again for joining me.
Thanks, Samira. Good to see you.
We don't give people much hope, but we keep an eye on stuff.
Truth. Hope is for fools. Truth is better.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Samira.